Sunday mornings used to feel safe. Sunlight streaming through stained glass, the soft scent of incense, the hush that settles when faith fills the air. I sat beside Albert, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the quiet comfort of routine. Father Thomas's voice rose from the pulpit, calm and familiar, wrapping the church like a lullaby. For a moment, I almost drifted, until his tone changed. It sharpened, heavy with something that felt personal. I lifted my eyes, and the peace I'd carried began to tremble. He spoke of temptation and redemption, of the sins people hide behind polite smiles. I remember thinking it sounded like any other sermon, until he said it. "A married man," he began, "came to me burdened by guilt for betraying his wife with his secretary." My heart skipped. My hands went cold. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. But deep down, something inside me already knew it wasn't. The words wrapped around my chest like a vice. I turned my head slightly and saw Albert staring at the floor, his face pale, his jaw tight. Every detail felt louder. The rustle of the pews, the shifting feet, the faint whisper of the choir. Father Thomas kept speaking, but I could no longer hear him. All I could hear was the pounding in my chest, wild, uneven, terrified. Confession, secretary, months. My mind repeated the words until they didn't sound like words anymore. Just proof. Proof I wasn't supposed to find like this. My heart wouldn't slow down, no matter how many hymns I whispered under my breath. The church felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer as if they too were listening. Father Thomas's words rolled on, painting my humiliation in sacred tones. He said his wife is pure, devoted, and undeserving of his deceit, he continued. People nodded solemnly, unaware that I was living that sentence in real time. I felt my cheeks flush, but not from shame, from the fire of realization. Albert shifted beside me, his breathing uneven. I caught a glimpse of his profile, the sweat at his temple, the way his thumb nervously traced the edge of the hymnal. My husband, the man who once swore loyalty before this very altar, sat there trembling under the same roof that had blessed our vows. I wanted to scream, but instead, I smiled faintly, just enough to keep the mask intact. Let him wonder if I knew. Let him sweat through his silence. Every word Father Thomas spoke was another nail sealing Albert's secret inside me. The rest of the Mass blurred. Children laughed, candles flickered, the choir sang something about mercy and grace. But none of it reached me. My mind was somewhere else, replaying the last few months. The late nights at the office, the faint smell of unfamiliar perfume, the sudden interest in cologne. It all made sense now, every piece of it fitting perfectly into betrayal's puzzle. I sat there, frozen in a moment that would divide my life in two, before the sermon and after it. I kept my posture calm, my hands still folded, as Father Thomas closed his sermon with a prayer about redemption. The irony nearly made me laugh. Redemption, he said, begins with truth. But I was sitting beside a man who'd built our marriage on silence and lies. Albert bowed his head, pretending to pray, his lips moving to words that meant nothing now. I watched him from the corner of my eye, the trembling fingers, the shallow breaths. He wasn't praying. He was hiding. When the congregation stood, I stood too, but the ground felt different beneath my feet. I looked at the altar, the place where promises once felt eternal, and it felt hollow, like a stage where our marriage had been performed. The sunlight spilling through the stained glass now looked cruelly bright, revealing everything I hadn't wanted to see. Albert reached for my hand as we stepped into the aisle, but I let his fingers brush mine and fall away. A gesture so small, but heavy enough to carry the message. I knew. Outside, the air was cool and too quiet. The world seemed the same, but I wasn't. Something inside me had shifted. Something calm, deliberate, and dangerously still. I didn't confront him, not yet. Not here. There's a kind of power in silence, one that grows stronger when fed by truth. He thought I was too gentle to fight back. He mistook my stillness for peace. He'd soon learn that the quietest women are often the ones who strike last. The church bells were still ringing when we stepped outside, but their sound no longer felt holy. It felt mocking. Albert walked ahead, pretending to straighten his jacket, his eyes fixed anywhere but on me. I followed, calm on the surface, though inside a storm gathered. The silence between us stretched like a rope pulled too tight. Every step toward the car felt heavier than the last. I could feel him rehearsing excuses in his head, waiting for the right moment to lie again. When we got in the car, the door shut with a dull thud that seemed to echo inside me. The smell of his cologne, that new expensive one he swore was just a change, filled the space. He gripped the steering wheel too hard, knuckles pale against the leather. I watched his reflection in the window, the twitch of his jaw, the flicker of guilt he couldn't quite hide. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Because pity has no place where betrayal lives. The engine started, and so did the performance. Small talk, forced smiles, empty breaths. I waited, letting the silence crawl between us, heavy and sharp. Finally, I said quietly, "You seemed uncomfortable in there." His laugh came too quickly, too light. Why would I be? That story was random. Random. I turned my head toward him, my voice steady but cold. A very specific kind of random, don't you think? And that was when he stopped laughing. He glanced at me for a second too long, the way someone does when they're calculating how much you already know. "Emma, you're being paranoid," he said, the words sliding out like a practiced defense. Paranoid, the favorite word of liars. I leaned back against the seat, keeping my voice soft, almost kind. "Then tell me," I whispered, "how does Father Thomas know about a man with a secretary, if it wasn't you?" The silence that followed was louder than any confession. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the road like the truth might appear in the distance if he stared hard enough. He didn't answer. Instead, his hand moved to the turn signal. Click, click, click. Each sound a heartbeat between us. "You're imagining things," he muttered finally, as if denial could rewind the morning. I turned toward him, studying the face I'd shared a life with, the same lips that had whispered promises, now shaping lies. "No," I said softly. "I'm remembering things." My voice trembled, but not from fear. "Like how you stayed late at the office 3 times last week, or how you started wearing cologne again, or how you suddenly care about your reflection more than your vows." He exhaled, long and shaky, gripping the wheel tighter. His silence was my answer, wordless, undeniable, almost merciful in its clarity. I stared out the window, the familiar streets blurring past, and felt something inside me settle. It wasn't peace, it was resolve, cold, deliberate, and patient. He thought this car ride would end with forgiveness, but forgiveness is a language I unlearned the moment he chose deceit over love, and I was ready to speak a new one. The rest of the drive stretched on in heavy silence. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade under the weight of what wasn't being said. I kept my gaze fixed on the passing trees, each one a blur of green and gold, wondering how many people lived their whole lives beside lies they refused to see. Albert's breathing was shallow, careful, like he was afraid even the air might betray him. I almost smiled at the thought. Guilt has its own language, and I was finally fluent. When we stopped at a red light, I turned to look at him fully. He avoided my eyes, pretending to check the mirror. "You're quiet," he said, his voice cautious, testing the waters. "So are you," I replied, but I suppose that's what happens when truth finally joins the conversation. The light turned green, and he pressed the gas too hard, desperate to move forward. But you can't outrun what sits beside you. You can only drive through it until it breaks you. As the house came into view, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind that only comes when pain finds its purpose. I wasn't going to scream, or throw things, or beg for an explanation. He expected chaos. Instead, I'd give him composure, the kind that unnerves, the kind that plans. He thought my silence was surrender, But silence, when used right, isn't weakness. It's strategy. And mine had only just begun. I didn't confront him again right away. Confrontation gives them power, lets them twist words until you start doubting your own reflection. So I waited. I smiled through dinners, folded laundry, played the loyal wife he still thought I was. But every small act became an armor, every quiet moment a step toward discovery. I'd been blindsided once, never again. My silence had a purpose now. It was gathering proof, piece by careful piece. A few days later, I decided to visit his office. I told myself it was just to bring him lunch, but we both know that wasn't true. The building smelled of coffee and stale ambition, the kind of place where people lose track of time and morals in the same breath. I walked in with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Hi," I said sweetly to the receptionist. "Is Albert around? I brought him something to eat." She looked up, nervous. Too nervous. "Oh, he's out with Claire," she said, her voice hesitant. "They had to meet a client." "Ah," I replied, keeping my tone light. "A client." The word tasted like metal in my mouth. She nodded quickly, fumbling with her papers. "They'll be back this afternoon." I thanked her and walked out, each step slower than the last. My pulse thudded in my ears, my hands trembling so hard I had to grip my purse to steady them. So it was her. The name that had been floating like a ghost in my mind finally had a face. Claire, the secretary who apparently liked field trips and borrowed husbands. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling above our bed felt like it was pressing down on me, each tick of the clock pulling me closer to a truth I already knew. Albert slept beside me, his breathing steady, peaceful, a man comfortable in his lies. I stared at him for a long time, wondering how someone could share your pillow and still feel like a stranger. Love makes you overlook things. Betrayal makes you see everything too clearly. I'd spent years trusting the sound of his heartbeat. Now I listened just to make sure he still had one. When I was sure he was deep asleep, I reached for his hand, tenderly, as if out of affection. I pressed his thumb against his phone, unlocking it without a sound. The glow from the screen lit up the room, soft and merciless. Dozens of messages, pictures, pet names, all with Claire. Each word carved a new wound, but I didn't cry. Tears would have given the moment too much power. I wanted control, not catharsis. I scrolled until I found the one that sealed it all. A message from her that read, "You looked so tense at church today. Did she notice?" My breath caught. My entire body went cold. So she had been there, sitting somewhere among the pews, watching me pray while she held the secret of my marriage in her hands. I looked over at Albert, sleeping like a man without consequence. I wanted to shake him awake, to make him face me, but instead I whispered into the darkness. "Oh, I noticed." It wasn't a cry. It was a promise. One he wouldn't hear until it was far too late. The next morning, he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, the same gesture he'd used for years. I let him. His touch felt foreign now, like a stranger borrowing my husband's skin. As the door shut behind him, I stood in the kitchen, the smell of his coffee still hanging in the air, bitter, overbrewed, and perfectly fitting. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Rage burns fast, strategy burns slow. And I was done wasting fire on a man who mistook my love for blindness. I sat at the table, scrolling through his messages again, reading each word like evidence in a case only I would try. The lies were ordinary, almost boring. "Lunch break soon? Miss you already. You smell like heaven." It's funny. When you strip the romance from deceit, what's left is pathetic. Just two cowards feeding each other's egos while calling it love. I wasn't jealous. I was insulted. If you're going to destroy a marriage, at least do it with poetry. By evening, my sorrow had hardened into something far sharper. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted clarity. And the only person who could give me that was the one who had sparked this entire unraveling, Father Thomas. If confession had started my undoing, Perhaps it could also guide my revenge. I wasn't looking for forgiveness. I was looking for understanding. And maybe, just maybe, a witness. 2 days later, I walked back into the church, not to pray, but to plan. The same sunlight that once felt holy now seemed harsh, almost interrogative. Father Thomas was in his office, sorting papers, his shoulders heavy with secrets he'd never be allowed to tell. When he saw me, his expression shifted from polite welcome to uneasy recognition. "Mrs. Wilson," he said softly, "how can I help you?" I smiled, the kind that hides more than it shows. "You spoke of a married man who came to confess his sins," I began. "I'd like to talk about him." He hesitated, setting the papers aside. "Emma," he said gently, "you know I cannot reveal what is said in confession." I leaned forward, folding my hands, my voice low and steady. "You don't have to, I already know." He looked away then, guilt flickering in his eyes. For a moment, the silence between us carried more truth than words ever could. "What I want to know," I continued, "is what he said about me." He swallowed hard, the collar around his neck suddenly looking more like a chain. "He said you were good," Father Thomas admitted, "that he doesn't deserve you." I nodded slowly, a quiet laugh escaping before I could stop it. Then at least, he was honest about one thing. The priest shifted, uneasy, watching me the way someone watches a storm form, powerless to stop it, yet unable to look away. I stood, adjusting my coat, feeling the weight of resolve settle in my bones. "I'm going to give him a different kind of absolution," I said softly. "One that ends with freedom." That Sunday, I went back to Mass, alone. I wore the same dress I'd worn the day of his confession, as if to let fate see how little it had managed to break me. The whispers began the moment I stepped inside, soft ripples of curiosity disguised as piety. I sat in our usual pew, the empty space beside me glowing like an accusation. Father Thomas's eyes found mine briefly before he began his sermon. This time, his voice trembled. Truth has a way of haunting even the holy. He spoke again about confession, how sin cannot survive the light. Each word fell heavy, deliberate, like stones being laid for a burial. I listened, every syllable igniting the fire I'd been tending in silence. When he finished, I stood. My knees didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble. The church was silent, save for the echo of my heels against the marble floor. Father Thomas reminded us that sin thrives in secrecy, I said clearly, my voice steady enough to make people turn. So let me bring mine, and my husband's, into the light. The congregation froze. Faces turned. Albert, seated a few rows behind, went pale as the candles flickering near the altar. "My husband, Albert Wilson," I continued, "has been sleeping with his secretary, for months." The words fell like thunder in a room built for prayer. I'm done living in silence. A gasp rolled through the church, a wave of disbelief and judgment. Albert stood abruptly, his shame radiating through every inch of him. I met his eyes and said, with quiet calm, "You confessed your sins to the priest. Now you can confess them to everyone else." Then I turned and walked out, not in anger, but in liberation. The air outside the church felt different, cleaner, lighter, almost forgiving. Behind me, I could still hear the low murmur of voices, the sound of a man's perfect image collapsing under the weight of truth. I didn't turn back. For years, that building had been a sanctuary for lies, a place where Albert hid behind stained glass and sacred words. But now it had become my witness. The truth didn't destroy me. It freed me. And as I walked down those stone steps, I realized I had never stood taller. In the days that followed, the silence that once protected him became the very thing that condemned him. People whispered in grocery aisles, colleagues stopped returning his calls, and the secretary who once smiled too brightly resigned in disgrace. I watched it all unfold without lifting a finger. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always need rage. It just needs exposure. And sometimes, light is the cruelest punishment of all. Every rumor, every whisper, every sideways glance was a hymn of justice I hadn't known I craved. At night, Albert tried to reach me. Calls, messages, hollow apologies wrapped in self-pity. I didn't answer. I'd already given him more than he deserved. My silence, my patience, my years. Now I had nothing left to offer but distance. The same distance he created when he chose deceit over devotion. It wasn't vengeance that kept me quiet now. It was peace. And peace, I discovered, has its own kind of power. By the end of the week, the entire town knew. Secrets don't stay buried long in places where gossip travels faster than prayer. Albert's name became a cautionary tale whispered between pews and over coffee cups. His company called him in for discussions, his clients stopped returning messages, and his friends, the same ones who once envied our marriage, vanished like smoke. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I simply observed it, the way one watches a storm finally exhaust itself. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers, "I told you so." Claire resigned quietly, of course. I imagine the shame followed her out of town, tucked neatly beside her packed boxes and the perfume I now recognized far too well. I almost pitied her, almost, because she wasn't the architect of my pain, Albert was. She was just another believer in his lies, another woman convinced she was the exception when she was only part of the pattern. Betrayal has a way of recycling itself, and they both learned that truth the hard way. Meanwhile, I thrived. It started small, sleeping through the night, eating in peace, feeling my chest rise without the weight of secrets. Then bigger things followed. I filed for divorce quietly, efficiently, keeping the house, the savings, the future. My lawyer called it a clean break. I called it redemption. For years, I'd lived in the shadow of a man's choices. Now, for the first time, the sunlight belonged entirely to me. When the papers were ready, Albert asked to see me one last time. We met in his office, the same one where his lies had lived, polished and professional. He looked smaller somehow, like guilt had been slowly hollowing him out. "You didn't have to ruin me in front of everyone," he said, his voice trembling between anger and regret. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "I didn't ruin you," I said evenly. "You did that all by yourself. I just handed you the microphone." He blinked, stunned, as if truth itself had slapped him. "I was sorry," he murmured. The word sorry felt cheap coming from him, like a used match pretending to start a fire. I tilted my head. "You were sorry you got caught. There's a difference." The silence that followed was heavy, years of resentment condensed into a moment that could have broken either of us. But it didn't break me. It never would again. I'd already survived the worst part, believing he was someone he wasn't. I slid the divorce papers across the desk. He hesitated, then signed, his hand shaking as if his name had finally become too heavy to carry. I gathered the documents, stood, and said quietly, "May your next confession be about honesty." His eyes followed me as I walked to the door, but I didn't look back. You only look back when you've lost something worth remembering. And I hadn't. When I left his office, the world felt strangely still, like the universe had paused to watch me reclaim my life. The air outside was cool, almost sweet, and for the first time in months I could breathe without flinching. There was no victory dance, no applause, just silence, soft and satisfying. I'd thought revenge would taste bitter, but it didn't. It tasted like clarity, like truth finally finding its voice after years of being shushed. I wasn't the same woman who'd sat in that pew weeks ago, praying for peace. I'd become my own answer. In the following days, I packed away the remnants of our marriage. Photographs, old notes, souvenirs of promises that meant nothing now. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. Every object I boxed up felt lighter than the last, as if my home was exhaling with me. Friends whispered their sympathies, neighbors offered pity wrapped in gossip, but I met them all with a small smile. People mistake calm for weakness. They don't understand that calm is what remains after the storm's already done its damage. At night, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the world outside keep spinning. Somewhere, Albert was learning how it felt to be truly alone. I didn't need to witness it. My justice was already complete. Because sometimes, revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about rebuilding yourself so completely that they can never touch you again. And that, I realized, was the truest freedom of all. Months later, I found myself in a small cafe I'd always walked past but never entered. It smelled like roasted coffee beans and second chances. I sat by the window reading a book I barely turned the pages of, just enjoying the quiet rhythm of my own company. Freedom has a sound, I've learned. It's the absence of tension in your chest, the stillness that hums softly when no one else owns a piece of you. My reflection in the glass didn't look older or wiser, just lighter, like I'd finally stepped out from under a shadow I hadn't realized was there. I saw Father Thomas walking by and waved him over. He looked surprised, then relieved. "Emma," he said, smiling gently, "you look at peace." I nodded, setting my book aside. "Peace has a funny way of showing up once the lies leave," I said. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you forgive him?" The question didn't sting anymore. It just floated between us like a feather. "Forgiving him was easy," I said with a small smile. "Forgetting him was easier." When I left the cafe, I walked past the church bell tower, the same one that had once echoed my humiliation. The bells rang again, same as always, but they didn't sound like judgment anymore. They sounded like freedom. I paused, looked up, and smiled. He had confessed his sins to the priest. But me? I'd made sure the whole world heard his penance, and for the first time in years, that felt like grace.